Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to a quick little 5.0 pre-release slash first impression on the leaks. I will be doing dedicated pre-release videos on Mulani and Kinich, but I can still give you guys my overall thoughts on what we have so far, because we actually have a lot. The first thing I want to talk about is the new artifacts. To put it bluntly, these artifact sets are very strong. There's a carry set and a support set. Two-piece for the carry set. When the equipping character is in Night Soul's Blessing and is on the field, their damage dealt is increased by 20%. Night Soul's Blessing is a Nutland exclusive mechanic. Both the two-piece and the four-piece are reliant on Night Soul, so non-Nutland characters effectively don't gain anything from this artifact set, like literally zero, like nothing. And Nutland characters enter the Night Soul's Blessing as a part of like the base way their kit functions. It's not a very difficult condition to fulfill for them. Alright, well, we'll talk about Night Soul in more detail later on. All you need to know is that this is an artifact set that only works on Nutland characters. And yeah, the most recent changes changed it to 15% damage percent on the two-piece. So effectively, 15% general damage percent on the two-piece, it's whatever. But what makes it good is the four-piece. After the equipping character consumes 10 Night Soul points while on the field, which again, another Night Soul mechanic, which we'll cover, but which is very easy for Nutland characters to fulfill, crit rate increases by 40% for 6 seconds. In other words, you get 15% damage percent and 40% crit rate, which is the same amount of stats you get from Blizzard's Raider. Except, as long as you're playing a Nutland character, it's effectively not a conditional buff. It effectively always works, which means that, unlike Blizzard's Raider, it's not weaker against bosses or something like that. So overall, it's just a very, very strong artifact set. I kind of like that. I think the reality that a lot of people are getting more and more aware of is that you kind of end up reaching the point where farming for an artifact improvement on your character becomes longer and longer and more boring. And getting effectively power creep on artifacts keeps the actual upgrades you can get on your artifacts much closer together in time, and it makes it feel a lot less stale. And because artifacts are not, I mean, yes, you can get more artifacts if you resin refresh, obviously, but artifacts are not something that is entirely gated behind spending and swiping. I kind of like the fact that they are introducing stronger artifacts. If I'm still farming Emblem 4 years from now, I'll reach the point where getting an upgrade on my Emblem is gonna on average take a full ass year of staying in the domain with literally no upgrades, which just isn't fun. So I think that artifact power creep is something that is actually relatively healthy for the game and that I kind of like. But obviously, this means that these artifacts are very strong, and for the Nutland characters, they're going to be pseudo-necessary. The second artifact set is a support set, and it is also very, very strong. Two-piece, when a nearby party member triggers a Night Soul Burst, the equipping character regenerates 6 energy. Night Soul Burst is another Night Soul mechanic, but effectively, you can think of this as 6 to 12 energy per rotation. Maybe once we get more Nutland characters, it's going to be a little bit more. And then the four-piece, when the equipping character triggers an elemental reaction involving their elemental type, all nearby party members of elemental types involved in that reaction gain 15% all elemental and physical damage bonus for 10%, which is a long way to say if you trigger a reaction, gain 15% damage and give your team 15% damage. I believe this has been changed to 12% in the most recent changes. When the equipping character is in Night Soul's Blessing, when triggering this, an additional 30% all elemental and physical damage will be granted to characters for 20 seconds. And again, right, this also has been changed to 28%. It's a total of 40%. 12% from the first effect, 40% from both of them. Effectively, what it means is it's 12% general damage percent as long as you trigger a reaction on any character, but it's 40% if your character is from Nutland. 40% damage percent from an artifact set is a lot. When looking at the damage you get from this, you can compare it to Archaic Petra, which is 35% and requires you to pick up the crystal. This does not require you to pick up the crystal and also buffs Geo if you trigger, let's say, Hydro Crystallize. You get the buff on your Geo and your Hydro characters. So it's effectively like strictly better than Petra outside of the two-piece not giving you 15% Geo damage, which often doesn't matter on characters that you're putting on Petra anyways. Compared to VV, it's generally less damage than what VV gives you, but VV is also a shorter duration and generally a bit harder to trigger reliably, and VV doesn't buff Animo. This is a very, very strong artifact set that is effectively going to be the reason why, maybe not a lot of the characters, but at the very least, the first support character we're getting from Nutland is relatively weak overall, because her ability to use this set means that if they also give her a strong kit, she's gonna be f***ing insane. because as it turns out, 40% from 40% damage from an artifact set is pretty damn good. And if you're also getting significant buffs from the rest of your kit, that's a really strong character. But yeah, speaking of which, our first support character is Kachina. She's a defense scaling character that has relatively underwhelming damage. Her damage is pretty much just worse than Albedo. However, she can use the set, which means that in a lot of the teams where you would use Albedo, you'd probably rather use her because of her ability to use this set. But I think that Kachina is a nice addition to the Geo characters. I think she fits both in Navia teams and Mono Geo teams. She does have a construct for Chiori if you want to play her with her. But yeah, you don't want to play her in a team that doesn't have any non-Geo characters because you want her to be able to trigger Crystallize in order to proc the artifact set. But you can play her with something like Ito, Goro, Yelan. Overall, she's not looking too strong, but I do think she's going to have some use for some of the Geo teams. Next up, we have the 2 new 5-stars. Mulani has just been hit with a pretty significant nerf, and we also have heard whispers that she's going to be hit with another significant nerf. And so, take everything I'm saying here with a pretty massive grain of salt. If we're talking about her first beta iteration, Mulani was a character that looked to be very strong. Effectively, what her kit wants to do is use your skill to start surfing. When you surf through enemies, you gain stacks up to 3, and at 3 stacks, you bite the enemies. And she doesn't do damage from surfing or apply hydro, which means that she's generally designed to be a forward vape character, although she can work in non-forward vape team, but that's the base thing that her kit is trying to do. She gets a lot more damage when she has 3 stacks than when she has 2, which means getting the 3rd stack is pretty important. It was a bit less important on her first iteration, but they pretty significantly nerfed the numbers of her 0, 1, and 2 stack chomps. Her ult is just some damage. But yeah, so she's pretty much just a forward vape unit. She's an HP scaler, so she's not reliant on Bennett. And that opens up a decent amount of interesting team building ideas for her. Her surfing lasts up to about 8 seconds, and it has a 6-second cooldown that starts at the end, which means that you can play her in like relatively short 15-ish second rotations, or you can try to either fit her into much longer 30-second rotations where you use her skill twice, or rotations where you don't use her skill exactly off cooldown, but you get more from the rest of your team. There's some interesting things to look into with a lot of different setups. Her inability to apply off-field hydro can make some of the setups a little bit more scuffed in order to get swirls if you want to get swirls. A lot of the stuff I've been looking into is either stuff that doesn't get swirls or stuff that cheats out swirls and pyro application from some like very specific setups, using Xinyan to self-infuse pyro or using Guoba as a form of pyro application. And so we'll pretend that Neuvillette is her, because we can just do like a normal charge attack to simulate slow pyro application. She is a catalyst user, so you can use her normal attacks to apply hydro. You can do something like this, and then use Kazuha's burst as your way to get pyro. Right, and in this case, the fact that when you swap with Xinyan's shield active, it applies pyro to your character, means that you can use that self pyro to absorb pyro into Kazuha's stuff, and therefore get off-field pyro application from his burst. If you have Xinyan C2, you can also use her burst if you need to extend your rotation as a form of pyro application, because it's going to get you a level 3 shield. That being said, if you're doing something like this, you're limiting yourself to slightly longer rotations because Xinyan's cooldowns are a bit longer. You'll also be able to do stuff like this with Strangling. Getting good timing matters a little bit more here, but it's not that big of a deal. You can still just do something like this. And then another 2. And that effectively gives you some no burst Strangling rotations, which I think are pretty interesting. But the main thing, the main reason why these teams are a thing is because her personal damage is actually high enough to be played as a hyper carry. You really do, if you're playing her in forward vape, you really do get enough return from literally just having her be the only source of damage on your team. It's not the only thing you can do. You can also play her in like double hydro teams with Farina, and it'll still be good. Don't you worry about that. But even in her current state after her first nerf, she's still very much going to be a character that you can justify just putting Strangling on your team and using your E and not using your ult and stuff like that. That being said, her performance in AoE is not going to be nearly as good as a character like Neuvillette, because the size of her AoE is just not Neuvillette. But yeah, I'm excited to know how much the rumored second nerf is going to be. We'll have to see if it's actually significant. So you can look forward to the pre-release if you want to know more about that. Make sure you subscribe. But yeah, I think that what she does for the roster is interesting because it's the first time we have an actual dedicated forward vape character, and it's something I've been wanting for a very long time. So having an actual dedicated forward vape carry, I think is quite exciting. It's gonna be pretty interesting for the team building, but her actual kit is relatively boring to me. It's not something that's all that interesting. Yeah, we'll have to see if she's fun to play. The other 5-star we have coming in 5.0 is Kinich, and this is a character that is much more interesting to me. Kinich is a Dendro character that rewards you for playing him in teams that run Pyro, either burning teams or Burgeon teams. And I guess this is a good moment to talk about Night Soul and how it works. There's 3 different Night Soul things. Effectively, Night Soul Burst, it just means when a Natlan character hits an enemy. That triggers Night Soul Burst. And it's a lot like Pneuma or Uzia in the sense that it can trigger something either on the enemies or, well, as you've seen from the artifact sets, but it doesn't do anything in and of itself, really. And then you have Night Soul Blessing. Night Soul Blessing is a state that Natlan characters can enter, so far all through their elemental skill. They enter the Night Soul state, and it gives them a little bar on the left of them that's very similar to the pseudo stamina bar that Wanderer has, that either goes up or down based on what the characters do. So for Mulani, it starts full, and it's effectively a timer on how long you can stay in your surfing. For Kinich, it starts empty, and based on different things you do, it fills up, and once it's filled up, you can use a stronger version of his elemental skill. So effectively, the way that Kinich works is once he uses his skill, he enters the Night Soul's Blessing, and it launches a grapple forward that will grapple onto any enemy. Once you're grappled onto an enemy, you can start spinning around them while shooting them, and once your Night Soul bar is full, you can shoot them with a much bigger bullet that does a lot more damage. While you're in that state, you get a little bit of points every second you spend in the state of Night Soul points, which fill your Night Soul bar. You get some points when you normal attack enemies while spinning. You get some points when enemies are burning or when a character in your team triggers Burgeon. And finally, every time when you use the skill, it'll highlight a sector of the circle, and if you enter that sector, it'll also give you points. So effectively, what you want to be doing is you grapple, you enter your state, you figure out which way you're supposed to spin to get to the sector the fastest. You start spinning that way while normal attacking, and once it's full, you launch your bullet, you figure out where the next sector is, and repeat. From what I've seen, it seems like the sector is always at a set angle from his current position. It's effectively just RNG if it's left or right. From what I've seen, the circle never spawned that far from him or that close to him. It always seemed to be around like 120 degrees from him. So effectively, you're playing around, generating as many points as possible, and shooting enemies when you have full points with a big cannon hit. The way that they've made him synergize with Burning and Burgeon is interesting because it effectively makes it so that he can get 4 cannon hits instead of 3, or 3 instead of 2, depending on how well you're spinning. But he effectively gets 1 more cannon hit in exchange for being able to trigger Burning or Burgeon, which actually means that it's not necessary to trigger Burning or Burgeon for him to be fine in a team. It just effectively gives him a benefit from those reactions. It really doesn't feel like it's that restrictive. It will incentivize teams, but it's not going to make you feel like ass if you're playing a team that doesn't make use of this passive. Like, generally the teams that make use of this passive will be stronger, but it's going to be a lot more like playing a double Geo team with Goro instead of triple Geo than like playing a Nilo team where you put a cryo unit in. So I like it a lot more. I think it is still a restriction, but I always like when restrictions are done like this a lot more because it still gives you some team building flexibility, which I enjoy a lot. And then his burst is just damage over time Dendro stuff. It's not all that great, but the animation is cool. You don't really get punished for using it that much either, because if you use it during your skill, it extends your skill's duration by about the burst animation's time. So you can use it during your skill and not get punished for it, which is nice. That pretty much covers it for the characters. Again, I'll get into a lot more detail in their individual pre-releases. Next up, I want to quickly cover the new 4-star weapons. We have 2 new HP catalysts. I don't know why they're both HP. One of them is an event catalyst. The other one is craftable. Gives us a slightly more damage-focused free-to-play option for Mulani, who's an HP scaler that deals normal attack damage compared to Prototype Amber, but yeah. The new bow is a little bit underwhelming to me because I feel like we just don't have too many users that are really in need of a good free-to-play bow. It's a fine option for Fischl, but generally Fischl is played in teams that have 2 electro characters, so you don't get the second part of the passive that gives elemental mastery. It's a fine attack percent stat stick. I don't think it's going to be all that great on anyone. We have a defense polearm that is effectively just for Kachina. I know a lot of people may be interested in this for Yunjin. With Yunjin, the main obstacle to her being able to use this weapon well is the fact that her ER requirements, when she's not on Fav, are like, depending on the team, sometimes above 400%, which is obviously not doable, but very often around 300%, which is also pretty much not doable without an ER weapon. In order for Yunjin's ER requirements to be low, you would need to play her with a good Geo battery, and there are no teams that really want to use Yunjin that also use a good Geo battery. It's a fine damage per screenshot option for Yunjin, because obviously it's going to be the weapon that gives the most defense to her. So if you just want your Yoimiya numbers to be as big as they can possibly be, you'll be able to put her on this. But in terms of, is it actually an improvement over Fav, I would say that generally no, it's not. But at least, hey, if you don't have Fav, you can use this. That's nice, I guess. Earthshaker, and the new craftable Claymore. When a party member triggers a pyro-related reaction, elemental skill damage is increased by 16 to 32. High base attack percent. This is going to be a nice free-to-play option for Kinich. And Navia, yeah, it can also be a good option on Navia. And finally, Flame Breath Flute, which is not a great weapon. Flame Breath Flute is the oh no, I missed Cinnabar Spindle, what am I gonna do weapon for people that play Albedo, but it's really bad in comparison. 32% defense on the passive is just not that good. It's gonna be a lot worse than Harbinger if you can actually use the Harbinger. I'm not too excited about it. Maybe we'll get a character who gives a buff that scales on defense though, so maybe there's a future for it. As of now, it's not too exciting. Oh yeah, they're adding every artifact to the Strongbox up to Maréchaussée, and unlike when they did it with Sumeru, this is including Maréchaussée, not excluding it, which means you'll be able to Strongbox Maréchaussée. Looking at it one-to-one, Maréchaussée is effectively just a weaker version of the new Nutland set, but if you already have it farmed, and you're playing your Nutland character in a team that uses Farina, then at least you can use it on them, and you'll have something ready before you have to farm for it. Outside of that, we've had whispers of an Artifact Selector that would let you choose main and or substats. The details of it are still very, very vague for now. I think it's important to remember for stuff like that unless it's actually farmable, it isn't actually that useful. Like, from what I understand, it's not something that lets you change leveled artifacts stats into something else. It's just something that lets you start with a better artifact, right? You can guarantee you'll get a double crit flower, for example, but you aren't guaranteed if the other stats are good or if it actually rolls into the crit, which is still, like, it's still useful, especially if you're farming for a new set, but it's also very possible that it doesn't end up giving you an upgrade at all. Yeah, like, the way I see it, it's mostly going to be used to get decent goblets, I think. Goblets or circlets. Maybe sands. I think its best use case is actually going to be to get you main stats for Gilded or whatever other thing you're using on a Hyperbloom character without having to farm pretty much any resin into it. But yeah, either way, it's a neat little thing that will be useful, but keep in mind, unless it is actually farmable in a way that doesn't cost resin, it's only going to slightly improve the early experience of getting a new set. It's not actually going to be that useful for most of us. It's still useful, for sure, don't get me wrong, but I don't want people to be like, oh my god, we're getting Artifact Selectors, huge, insane, and then they see what it actually turns out to be, and they're like, oh. We can be cautiously optimistic. That's pretty much it. So I'd say overall 5.0 is looking like a stronger start compared to 4.0. I'd say there's more interesting things overall. As usual, don't spend money on this shit game, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.